The Unseen Path. Chapter 1. The Stranger at the Door. It was a rainy evening when Nora first met him. The kind of evening where the rain seemed endless, a steady drumbeat against the windows of her new apartment. The apartment was small, tucked away on the edge of the city, a place far from the hustle and bustle of the downtown area, and a world away from her old life. Nora had never imagined she'd end up in a place like this, but it was all she could afford after the breakup and the aftermath of her brother Adam's disappearance. Nora stood by the window, her fingers tracing the water droplets that raced down the glass. Her gaze was distant, not really looking at anything, just lost in thought. She hadn't heard from Adam in years, not since that strange night when he'd disappeared. The police had told her to move on, that there was nothing they could do, that he'd likely run away. But Nora knew Adam better than anyone. He hadn't run. Something had happened to him. She could feel it in her bones, a deep ache that never left her, not even after all this time. She had been alone ever since, her life a series of days spent in the same small apartment, trying to make a life for herself, to make sense of the puzzle that was her family. Her parents had disappeared years ago, swallowed up by the shadows of their own secrets, and her brother. Her brother was a mystery that refused to be solved. Just as she turned away from the window, feeling a knot tighten in her chest, a knock came at the door. It was sudden and unexpected. She froze for a moment, unsure whether she should even open it. She wasn't expecting anyone. She hadn't made any friends since moving here. Not that she was looking for company. Another knock, this one louder, more insistent. Her heart skipped a beat. Who could it be? With a deep breath, she walked cautiously toward the door, peering through the peephole. She could just make out the figure of a man standing on the other side. His features were obscured by the dim light from the hallway, but he seemed familiar somehow. That only made her more uneasy. Nora hesitated for a moment, then decided to open the door just a crack. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice wary but polite. The man standing there looked to be in his early 30s, with dark, damp hair and sharp features. He was wearing a long, soaked coat, the rain running off of him in rivulets. His eyes, however, were the most unsettling part. Gray, too gray, like a storm that would never break. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said, his voice smooth but with an edge of urgency. "But I'm looking for someone. I think they used to live here." Nora felt her pulse quicken. "Who are you looking for?" she asked, her breath catching in her throat. The man seemed to study her for a moment, his eyes scanning her face as if weighing something. He took a small step closer. "A man named Adam Blackwell. Do you know him?" At the mention of her brother's name, a rush of heat flooded Nora's chest. Her throat went dry, and she felt as though the world had tilted on its axis. "Adam's my brother," she managed to say, the words tasting strange in her mouth. She hadn't said his name out loud in years, and hearing it again felt like something alive inside her had stirred. The man's expression softened ever so slightly. "I know," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's why I'm here." Nora's mind raced, trying to process the sudden flood of emotions that crashed over her. Adam had disappeared without a trace. No phone call, no goodbye. The police had written it off as a runaway case, but Nora had never believed that. She knew something had happened to him, something terrible. And now this stranger was telling her he knew about him. "Where is he?" Nora asked, her voice thick with fear and anticipation. "What happened to him?" The man's eyes flickered with hesitation, but then he spoke, his voice heavy with something she couldn't quite place. "I'm not entirely sure, but I've been looking for him for a long time. He's in trouble, Nora. Deep trouble. And I need your help to find him." The words didn't sink in at first. Help him? How could she help? She was just as lost as this stranger. Her whole life had been a string of unanswered questions since Adam's disappearance. What could she possibly do now that she was being dragged back into the same dark unknown? "Who are you?" she finally asked, trying to steady her racing heart. "What's going on?" "I'm Lucas Vale," the man said, stepping back slightly, as if to give her space to breathe. "I'm a private investigator." Nora took a deep breath, her mind swirling with disbelief. "A private investigator? You've been looking for my brother. Why?" Lucas didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced over his shoulder, as if making sure no one else was nearby. "Because Adam didn't just disappear, Nora. He was taken." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Nora's legs went weak, and she had to grip the doorframe to steady herself. "Taken?" she repeated, barely able to breathe. "What do you mean? Who took him?" Lucas's eyes darkened. "That's what I need to find out. And I think you're the key." Chapter 2. The Past Unraveled. Nora's mind raced. She had spent years agonizing over what happened to Adam, wondering if he had run away, gotten into trouble, or worse. But taken. That thought was a cold, sharp knife in her chest. It left her breathless, unable to form the questions she desperately wanted to ask. How could someone take her brother? And if he had been taken, by who? Lucas noticed her sudden silence and gave her a moment to collect herself. The rain outside had picked up, tapping rhythmically against the window. Nora stood motionless, staring at him as if trying to read his every movement. But his face was unreadable, his demeanor calm, as though he had been down this road before. Finally she spoke. "What do you mean, taken? My brother? Was he kidnapped?" Her voice trembled at the thought. Lucas stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, shaking off his coat. His boots left water droplets on the hardwood floor, but Nora didn't care. She was still trying to absorb what he had said, each word heavy with implications she couldn't quite grasp. "I don't know exactly who, but yes," Lucas said, his voice low, careful. "Kidnapped, but not in the way you're thinking. Adam got involved with the wrong people, Nora. People who don't let you walk away. And they've been looking for him ever since." Her stomach twisted in knots. The idea that Adam could have been pulled into something dangerous was one thing. But to think that he had been caught up in something so deep that they, whoever they were, had taken him. That was an entirely different world, a world Nora hadn't even begun to imagine. "Who are these people?" she asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. Lucas met her eyes, his gaze unwavering. "They're part of a syndicate, Nora. A group that deals in everything from stolen goods to underground operations. I've been tracking them for years, and your brother, he got involved with them somehow. I don't know how, but I've got a few leads." Her head spun. Her brother, Adam, the boy she had grown up with, her partner in mischief and late-night talks. How had he gotten involved in something so dark? But why would they take him? Why wouldn't they just... Nora stopped herself, the words hanging in the air. Why wouldn't they just kill him? Lucas hesitated, a flicker of something dark passing across his face. Because he knows something. Something important. And those people will stop at nothing to get it. Adam got mixed up in something much bigger than he realized. I don't think he understood the full extent of what he was getting involved with. Nora's legs suddenly felt weak, and she sank into the chair by the window. What's the something? What could Adam possibly know that would make them come after him like this? "I don't know yet," Lucas admitted. "But I think it's tied to your father." Nora's breath hitched. Her father. The man who had disappeared when she was just a child, leaving her with unanswered questions and a lifetime of pain. For years she had tried to move on, to stop thinking about him, to forget the bitter ache of abandonment. And now this. "What does my father have to do with this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Lucas's expression darkened. "I think your father was involved with the same people Adam got tangled up with. I don't know the details, but I've seen enough to know that whatever happened to your father, it's all connected. And I think your brother, he might be the key to unlocking all of it." Nora's thoughts swirled in a dizzying vortex. She felt like the ground beneath her was giving way, pulling her deeper into a world she didn't know. Her father, Adam, and now this man, Lucas, who seemed to know more than he was letting on. It was too much. Too much for her to wrap her head around. "So you're telling me," she said, her voice shaking, That my father and brother are both involved in something illegal, and you want me to help you find Adam? Lucas nodded. I know it sounds crazy, but if we don't find him soon, Nora, we could lose him. And whatever he knows, whoever's after him, they won't stop until they have it. Nora sat in stunned silence. For the first time in years, the fragments of her past were starting to form a pattern. A dangerous, frightening pattern. Her father's disappearance, Adam's sudden vanishing act, and now this strange man in her living room, telling her things she wasn't sure she was ready to hear. But what if I don't want to get involved? She asked, her voice small, her hands trembling in her lap. I understand, Lucas said, his voice quiet and genuine. But think about it, Nora. If you don't help me, then Adam will be left alone in the middle of this. And I know you've been waiting for years for answers. I can give you those answers, but only if you trust me. Nora's heart hammered in her chest. She was terrified. Terrified of what she might find, of what she might lose. But she also knew that she couldn't live the rest of her life wondering about Adam. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when her brother's life hung in the balance. Okay, she whispered almost to herself. I'll help you. Lucas's face softened slightly. Thank you. He pulled out a small, worn notebook from his coat pocket and handed it to her. This is everything I've gathered so far. Names, locations, things that don't add up. Take a look. We need to get started. Nora took the notebook, her hands shaking as she opened it. The pages were filled with scrawled notes, names, and photos. Some of the faces were blurry, but one name stood out. Marcus Calder. He was listed multiple times. First in connection to Adam, then her father, and finally, a series of dates that seemed to align with Adam's disappearance. Nora's stomach dropped. Who is Marcus Calder? She asked, pointing to the name. Lucas's jaw tightened. Marcus is the man behind the syndicate. He's dangerous, and he's been keeping an eye on your family for years. I think Adam's discovery might have something to do with him. Nora felt a chill run down her spine. She had no idea what kind of world her family had been living in, but she knew now that she was far too deep to turn back. Chapter 3. The Trail of Shadows. The rain hadn't stopped, and neither had Nora's thoughts. Every time she closed her eyes, Marcus Calder's name swirled in her mind, a reminder of the dangerous unknowns they were diving into. She sat at the small kitchen table, the notebook Lucas had given her open in front of her. The dim light from the overhead bulb cast long shadows on the pages, the handwriting jagged and hasty. Nora felt as though she were standing on the edge of a cliff, peering into the dark abyss below, and with every page she turned, she was only getting closer to the fall. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, almost mocking her as she stared at the blurred photo of Marcus Calder. A man she had never met, yet his name held so much weight in her life now. But it wasn't just him. It was the whole web of people. Her father's connections, Adam's disappearance, and now Lucas, who was still a mystery in her own right. The questions kept swirling in her head like an endless storm. What was it that Adam had uncovered? What had her father gotten into that had turned their entire family's world upside down? Why had they been dragged into this dark underworld in the first place? And what would be waiting for them at the end of this trail? Nora looked up at Lucas, who had been quiet, his eyes scanning the notes as if he were piecing together something that only he could understand. He seemed at ease, calm even, as though everything that had been unfolding was just another case to him. But she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something he wasn't telling her. There was too much about his past, too many unanswered questions. And if she was going to help him, she had to know the truth about him too. I need to know something, Lucas, she said, breaking the silence. Why are you involved in this? Why did you start looking for Adam? What's your stake in all of this? Lucas glanced up from the notes, his expression unreadable. He was quiet for a moment, his eyes narrowing as if measuring his words. Then, with a sigh, he set the notebook down and leaned back in his chair. I wasn't always a private investigator, Nora, he said slowly, his voice low. I used to be in law enforcement. I was part of a task force that was investigating organized crime, syndicates like the one your brother got tangled up in. We were making progress, shutting them down, one cell at a time. He paused, his eyes momentarily clouding with something darker. But then my partner, the man I trusted like a brother, was killed. We were closing in on Marcus Calder, and it was my mistake that cost him his life. Nora's heart tightened as she watched him. There was a raw pain in his eyes, something he didn't usually let slip through. She could see that this wasn't just a job for him. It was personal. I know what it's like to lose someone you care about, Lucas continued, his voice steady but strained. After that, I couldn't walk away. So, I kept digging, I kept looking into the syndicates, trying to get closer to Calder, trying to finish what I started. And when I found out about your brother, I knew I couldn't let him get swallowed up by that world too. Nora absorbed his words, her mind processing them carefully. His story made sense now, but it didn't explain everything. There was still something he wasn't telling her, something that lingered in the silence between them. I'm sorry about your partner, Nora said quietly, unsure of what else to say. But I still don't understand how you know about my family. Why would Calder have anything to do with Adam and my father? Lucas leaned forward, his eyes fixed on her, as though he were trying to gauge how much to reveal. Your father didn't just disappear, Nora. He wasn't just a regular businessman. He had ties to people like Calder. He was mixed up in some of the same dealings. And your brother, Adam, probably found something out, something that Calder needed to keep buried. Your father was involved in more than just shady deals. He was tangled in the world of organized crime long before you ever knew it. Nora sat back stunned. She had spent years believing that her father had simply vanished, that it was just a tragedy she had no control over. But now, she was starting to see that his disappearance might have been anything but simple. He hadn't just run away. He had been involved in something dangerous, something that had cost him everything. Then why didn't you tell me this before? She asked, her voice trembling with frustration. Why didn't you tell me my father was involved in all of this? Why hide it from me? I didn't want to put you in more danger, Lucas answered, his voice steady. I had to be sure before I said anything. I knew it would change everything, and I needed you to make your own decisions without all the weight of this world on your shoulders. But now we're too far into this. There's no turning back. Nora ran her hand through her hair, trying to make sense of the whirlwind around her. It was all so much to take in. Her father's secrets, Adam's involvement, and Lucas's role in everything. She had to process it all, and fast, because time was running out. So what now? She asked, her voice thick with determination. What do we do next? Lucas reached for the notebook again, flipping through the pages until he stopped at a particular photo. He slid it across the table to her. It was a grainy image of a man in a dark suit standing outside a building. The man's face was partially obscured by a hat, but his posture, his stance, was unmistakable. This was someone important, someone who had been involved in everything. This man, Lucas said, pointing to the image. His name is Victor Silas. He works directly with Marcus Calder. And he's the one who can lead us to Adam. Nora's eyes widened as she stared at the photo. Something about this man felt different from the others in the notebook. There was a darkness in his gaze, a coldness that sent a shiver down her spine. We need to find him, Lucas continued. And when we do, we'll have a chance to find Adam. But we have to be careful. Silas is ruthless. He'll do anything to protect Calder's secrets. Nora nodded, feeling the weight of their mission settle heavily on her shoulders. They had a target now, someone they could track down, someone who could give them answers. But they also had to be prepared for whatever dangers lay ahead. And Nora knew, deep down, that whatever they were about to uncover would change everything she thought she knew about her family, and about herself. Chapter 4. Into the Abyss. The next morning the rain had finally stopped, but the air remained heavy, thick with anticipation. Nora felt a gnawing tension in her stomach that wouldn't go away. She barely slept, her mind racing with images of Victor Silas, her father's hidden life, and the maze of secrets that seemed to encircle everything she thought she knew. She couldn't shake the feeling that with every step they took closer to the truth, they were also pulling themselves deeper into a world that would be impossible to escape from. Lucas had been organizing their next move, gathering what he could from his network, but Nora could sense that he was just as on edge as she was. For all his calm demeanor, there was something raw beneath the surface. She had seen it when he talked about his partner's death, when he spoke of Calder's organization, and when he revealed how deeply connected her family was to the criminal world. Nora wasn't sure if she trusted him completely, but right now, he was her only ally in a situation that had grown beyond her control. They sat in the kitchen over cups of coffee, both silent for a long time. Lucas flipped through his notebook again, jotting down notes in the margins as he tried to piece together the timeline of events. Nora couldn't help but study him, trying to find a clue to what he was thinking. He had his guard up, too many walls built over the years, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could rely on him without knowing more of his story. Finally, she broke the silence. "So, what exactly are we looking for when we find Victor Silas? I don't even know where to start." Lucas looked up, his eyes dark with the weight of the task ahead. "We need information. Silas is the key to finding Adam. He's worked with Calder for years, and whatever Adam uncovered, Silas probably knows more than anyone. I've been tracking his movements, but he's careful. We can't just waltz up and ask him questions. He'll never let us get that close." Nora nodded. "And if we can't find him, what then?" "We'll find another way," Lucas said, his voice firm. "But finding Silas is our best shot. If we get to him first, we might be able to turn the tables." That was a big if, and they both knew it. Lucas didn't speak much as they gathered their things and prepared to leave. Nora watched him closely, taking in the way he moved. His calm, measured steps, the way he tucked the notebook into his jacket pocket like it was his lifeline. She realized then that Lucas wasn't just a stranger showing up at her door. He was someone who had been through hell and come out the other side, and now he was dragging her with him into the fire. They left her apartment in silence, the air outside still thick with the remnants of the storm. The city streets were slick, the pavement glistening in the weak sunlight as people hurried along, trying to shake off the morning chill. Nora felt the weight of her own thoughts pressing in on her, drowning out the sounds of the world around her. Lucas led the way down a narrow alley to an old, nondescript car parked in a dimly lit corner. It looked like a car no one would pay attention to, a perfect choice for someone who wanted to remain unnoticed. He opened the passenger door for her, and she climbed in, glancing around as if expecting someone to jump out from the shadows. But it was just the two of them. "Where are we headed?" she asked, trying to steady her nerves. "I have a contact who can give us a lead on Silas. Someone who knows the ins and outs of his operation," Lucas said, his eyes on the road. "I've arranged a meeting with him. It's not going to be easy, and we'll have to be careful." Nora didn't ask any more questions. She wasn't sure she wanted to know all the details. She had learned the hard way that the less she knew, the better. The drive was long, the city's skyline fading behind them as they ventured into the darker parts of town. The area they were headed to was filled with abandoned buildings and broken streets, a part of the city that had long been forgotten by the rest of the world. Nora glanced out the window, her unease growing as they neared a run-down industrial complex. The air smelled faintly of oil and rust, and the sound of distant machinery hummed in the background. "We're here," Lucas said as he pulled the car into a dimly lit parking lot. There was only one other car there, an old sedan with tinted windows. "Stay close, and don't say anything unless I tell you to." Nora nodded, her heart racing. She followed him as he led her to the entrance of a large, crumbling building. The lights flickered overhead, casting erratic shadows across the walls. They walked in silence, each step echoing through the empty halls. Lucas knocked on a door at the far end of the corridor, the sound harsh and sharp. The door creaked open, revealing a man standing in the shadows. He was tall, wearing a black jacket and a baseball cap that obscured most of his face. His eyes glinted in the low light, watching them both with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "Lucas Vale," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. "I've heard things about you." "I'm not here for a chat," Lucas replied, his voice tense. "I need information on Victor Silas. You know where I can find him." The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied Nora with a piercing gaze. She felt a chill run down her spine as he seemed to weigh her presence. Finally, he turned his attention back to Lucas. "I might know something," the man said, his voice softening. "But it's not going to come cheap." "I don't have time for games," Lucas said, his patience thinning. The man smirked. "You're not the one paying. She is." Nora's stomach dropped as she realized what was happening. The man wasn't just a contact. He was playing a game of his own. And she was the pawn. "What do you want from me?" she asked, trying to steady her breathing. The man stepped closer, his face now fully visible under the dim light. He was older than she expected, with graying hair and a scar that ran down the side of his cheek. He looked dangerous, like someone who had lived too long in the shadows. "I want you to help me with something first," he said, his lips curling into a twisted smile. "And then I'll tell you everything you need to know about Silas." Chapter 5. The Cost of Secrets. The man's gaze on Nora felt like a weight pressing against her chest, suffocating her. His eyes were cold, calculating, and every instinct inside her screamed that she needed to get away. But she couldn't. Not now. Not with Adam still missing, with so many pieces of this tangled puzzle still out of place. She had no choice but to follow Lucas into this dark world, one step after the other. "What do you want me to do?" Nora asked, her voice tight with controlled anxiety. Her fingers curled around the strap of her bag, trying to focus on something, anything, other than the man's unsettling presence. The man chuckled softly, stepping closer to her. His breath smelled faintly of tobacco and something bitter like old whiskey. "You've got spunk, I'll give you that. But you'll need more than spunk to get out of this. First, though, you're gonna help me with a little task. Then I'll tell you what you want to know about Victor Silas. I'll even tell you where to find him." Nora glanced at Lucas, her heart pounding in her chest. He stood a few paces behind her, his posture stiff, his eyes narrowing, but he didn't move to intervene. This was his plan. He had known this would happen. She was part of this now, part of a world she had no idea how to navigate. "What kind of task?" Nora asked, trying to keep her voice steady, even though her thoughts were spinning. The man leaned in closer, his breath brushing against her ear. "I've got a few things I need collected. Simple, really. You find a warehouse just outside of the city. Nothing special, but it's got a shipment I need brought to me. Easy money, I promise." The way he spoke, with that slow, deliberate drawl, made Nora's skin crawl. She had heard about people like him, the kind who seemed to live outside the law, who made their own rules and treated others like pawns on a chessboard. But she hadn't expected to be dragged into his game so quickly. "No," Lucas interjected, stepping forward, his voice low and controlled. "We're not here for favors, and we don't have time for distractions." The man's eyes flicked over to Lucas, and for a moment, Nora saw something in his expression, a flash of recognition, maybe even a glimmer of respect. But it didn't last. He straightened, taking a step back and folding his arms across his chest. "You're a little too eager to play hero, aren't you?" the man sneered. "You won't get anywhere without my help, Lucas. You know that. If you want the info on Silas, she's got to do the job. No other way." Nora felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had no idea what was in that warehouse, what kind of shipment it could be. But the man's words were clear. If she didn't do it, she wouldn't get the information they needed to find Adam. Lucas' jaw tightened. "Fine. What's the address?" The man smirked. "I knew you'd come around. The warehouse is on the edge of the industrial district, about 20 miles from here. It's marked on the map." He tossed a folded piece of paper onto the table between them. Pick up the package, bring it back here, and we'll talk about Silas. Nora picked up the map, her fingers brushing the rough edges of the paper. She glanced at Lucas, but he didn't offer her any reassurance. His eyes were hard, calculating. He was just as trapped as she was. They didn't have a choice. "Let's go," Lucas said, his tone sharp, his voice barely concealing the tension in it. Without a word, they both turned and left the building, stepping out into the gray, overcast afternoon. The air felt thick, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Nora's mind raced as they walked toward the car. What was in that warehouse? Who was this man, and why was he so eager to get his hands on whatever was being stored there? The drive was long and silent, the landscape gradually shifting from the worn-out streets of the city to the desolate industrial zone on the outskirts. The buildings here were more dilapidated, the streets emptier, almost abandoned. The further they drove, the more Nora felt like she was heading into a world that didn't belong to her. A place where the rules didn't apply, where everything was for sale and nothing was safe. When they finally reached the warehouse, Nora couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding settle over her. The place was dark, grimy, with cracked windows and rusted metal doors. It looked like a place that had been forgotten by time, a place where things went in and never came out. "Stay close," Lucas said, his voice low. "If anything goes wrong, we get out fast. No questions." Nora nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt like a pawn being moved across a chessboard. No matter what she did, the game had already started, and there was no turning back. They made their way to the entrance, a metal door that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Lucas reached for the handle and gave it a cautious tug. To her surprise, the door opened with ease, revealing a dark interior, the air thick with the smell of oil and decay. Nora's eyes adjusted to the dim light as she followed Lucas inside. "Where's the package?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper in the cavernous space. Lucas scanned the room, his eyes sharp, searching for any signs of movement. "It should be in the back, near the far wall." They moved carefully, each step echoing in the silence of the warehouse. The only sounds were their footsteps and the occasional creak of metal, as if the building itself was protesting their intrusion. As they reached the back of the warehouse, Nora's eyes landed on a large crate in the corner. It was wrapped in plastic with no markings or labels, just an ominous black box sitting in the shadowed corner. "That's it," Lucas said, his voice low. "Grab it, and let's get out of here." Nora hesitated for a moment, a strange sense of dread crawling up her spine. Something about this didn't feel right. She wasn't just picking up a package, she was picking up a piece of someone else's world, someone's dangerous game. She bent down to lift the crate, but as her fingers brushed against it, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind them. "Nora," Lucas hissed, grabbing her arm. "We're not alone." Before she could respond, the warehouse door slammed shut, plunging them into darkness. Chapter 6: The Trap. The sound of the warehouse door slamming shut echoed in the darkness, vibrating through Nora's chest like a warning bell. Her heart skipped a beat, and before she could process the noise, the air seemed to shift. The oppressive silence that had been hanging over them was now filled with the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and drawing closer. Nora's pulse quickened. She could feel Lucas stiffen beside her, his grip tightening around her arm, pulling her slightly behind him as if he were trying to shield her from whatever danger was approaching. "Get the crate," Lucas whispered urgently. His voice was low, but the tension in it was clear. "I'll hold them off." Nora swallowed, her throat dry. The crate was heavy, but she could feel its weight shift under her hands as she struggled to lift it. Every instinct in her screamed to run, to leave the warehouse and never look back, but she couldn't. Not yet. They needed the information, and she had to trust Lucas, even though every part of her told her that they were walking into a trap. She managed to lift the crate, but it wasn't easy. It was bulky, unwieldy, and every movement felt like it was slowing her down. She could hear the footsteps getting louder, the sound now accompanied by the scraping of metal on concrete. Several someones were closing in on them. Move! Lucas urged, his voice a sharp command. Without thinking, Nora turned and ran, the crate still clutched tightly in her arms, the sound of her footsteps drowned out by the thundering rush of adrenaline coursing through her. She could hear Lucas behind her, but she didn't dare look back. As they neared the exit, Nora saw the shadow of a figure in the dim light, tall, broad-shouldered and blocking their path. The man stepped forward, a dark silhouette against the faint glow from the streetlights outside. He was carrying something in his hand, something heavy, likely a weapon, and his expression was hidden beneath a hood that shadowed his face. Going somewhere? The man's voice was a low growl, and Nora could hear the menace in it. Lucas stopped dead in his tracks, pushing Nora slightly behind him as he faced the man head-on. He was calm, too calm, and it sent a chill down Nora's spine. She had no idea what Lucas had planned. She only knew they were outnumbered and they were trapped. "I don't want trouble," Lucas said, his voice steady, though there was a subtle edge to it. "Just let us go." The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped closer, the sound of his boots scraping against the concrete floor. Nora's breath caught in her throat as she tried to make out his features in the darkness, but all she could see were those cold, unblinking eyes staring at her from beneath the hood. He didn't look like someone who would back down. "You're not leaving," the man said, and his tone made it clear that this wasn't a negotiation. "Not with that package." Nora's heart dropped. The crate, it wasn't just a delivery. It wasn't some harmless shipment. It was a key to something bigger, something far more dangerous than she could have imagined. "We don't want any trouble," Lucas repeated, his voice now laced with a quiet but unmistakable threat. "If you want the crate, you'll have to take it from us." The man smirked, and in that instant, Nora saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Something predatory, something that told her this was no ordinary thug. This was someone with experience, someone who had killed before without hesitation. "Is that so?" The man's smirk deepened. "I'm afraid I'll have to insist." Before she could react, the man lunged, his hand reaching for the crate. Nora barely had time to adjust her grip before Lucas moved, his body a blur of motion as he shoved the man away, forcing him back several steps. The man stumbled, momentarily thrown off balance, but he quickly regained his footing. Nora's pulse hammered in her chest as she watched them both. A fight was about to break out, and she wasn't sure she was ready for it. Then, as if the world had tilted on its axis, the sound of several other doors opening rang through the warehouse, and Nora's heart froze. More men had entered. They were surrounding them. "Lucas," she whispered, her voice trembling as she glanced around frantically. "We're surrounded." Lucas's face hardened. His hand tightened around the gun holstered at his side, though he didn't pull it out yet. He was assessing the situation, calculating their chances. But it was clear they were in deep trouble. "We need a way out," he said, his voice tight with the pressure of the situation. "Now!" Before Nora could respond, the man who had initially confronted them lunged again, faster this time, his hand shooting out to grab her arm. The force of his grip was like iron, and Nora gasped as he yanked her toward him, spinning her into his chest. "Don't try anything," he growled in her ear, his breath foul against her skin. "You're in my world now." She could feel his hot breath against her neck as he dragged her away from Lucas, his grip unyielding. The crate slipped from her hands, landing with a heavy thud on the cold concrete floor. "Let her go," Lucas shouted, his voice rising in fury. The man didn't answer, but instead, he shoved Nora roughly toward the others, who had now closed in, cutting off any hope of escape. Nora's mind was a blur, her thoughts spiraling in panic, but she fought to keep herself steady, to not let fear take over. In the chaos, she caught sight of one of the men pulling out a knife, gleaming under the dim light. It was sharp, and the glint of it sent a cold shiver up her spine. Lucas was outnumbered. And it was clear now. This wasn't just some random encounter. They had walked right into a trap. Just as the man's hand tightened on Nora's wrist, a sudden loud noise broke through the tension, the unmistakable sound of a gunshot. The world seemed to slow. The man who had been holding her dropped to the ground, a look of shock spreading across his face as he crumpled, his grip on her loosening. A sharp pain flared in Nora's chest, but it wasn't hers, it was the man's. She didn't understand what had just happened, but she didn't need to. She glanced around in confusion, and then she saw him. A shadow at the edge of the warehouse. Victor Silas. Chapter 7. The enemy you know. The echo of the gunshot still rang in Nora's ears, but it was quickly replaced by a deeper silence, one that felt suffocating like the calm before a storm. The man who had been holding her collapsed to the floor, the shock on his face quickly fading into a grimace of pain as he tried to clutch at the wound in his chest. Blood stained his clothes, spreading in dark red pools against the cracked concrete. Nora stood frozen, unsure of what had just happened, and her heart was racing in her chest. Her mind couldn't fully comprehend the sequence of events. 1 minute she was being dragged away. The next, a figure in the shadows had taken down their assailant with deadly precision. She glanced toward Lucas, who was still facing the rest of the men. He was tense, his gun now drawn, his stance defensive as the situation quickly spiraled. But his eyes were locked on something, or rather someone in the shadows. Victor Silas stepped forward slowly, the gun still in his hand, smoke curling from the barrel. He was dressed in black, a sleek dark coat draped over his frame, his expression as cold as ever. He hadn't changed much since the last time Nora had seen him. Nora's breath caught in her throat. Victor was an enigma, a shadow in her father's past, a name that had always haunted the edges of the family's darkest stories. Now, here he was, standing before her, the last person she ever expected to save her life. Or perhaps, the last person she ever expected to get involved in her search for the truth. Victor's eyes scanned the scene with disinterest, his gaze flickering briefly to the fallen men before settling on her. He didn't offer any words of comfort or explanation, but his cool demeanor said everything she needed to know. "I didn't expect you to be involved," Victor said, his voice low, laced with an eerie calm. "But here you are." Nora could hardly believe what she was hearing. The pieces were starting to come together, but they didn't make sense. Was Victor Silas really the one who had just saved them? And if so, why? "Silas," Lucas growled, his grip tightening on his gun. He hadn't lowered it, even though he was facing the one person who could blow his whole operation wide open. "I should have known you'd be behind this. You've been pulling the strings all along, haven't you?" Victor's lips curled into a faint smile, but it wasn't warm. "You've been poking around for far too long, Lucas," he said coolly. "It's time you learned some truths." Nora stepped forward, her heart racing as she processed the words. Her thoughts scrambled to make sense of everything she had just learned. The man who had always been a specter in her father's life was standing right in front of her, making himself known in the most dramatic way possible. He was the key to all of it, the missing piece in the puzzle, the reason everything in her life had come apart. "Why are you helping us?" Nora finally managed to ask, her voice shaking. "Why save me?" Victor's smile deepened slightly, but it wasn't kindness that flickered across his face. It was something darker, something more dangerous. "Helping you is a complicated matter," he said slowly. "But we've all been drawn into the same game, whether we like it or not." The weight of his words hung in the air between them, heavy and oppressive. Nora could feel the tension building again, like a fuse ready to explode. She tried to steady herself, focusing on the one thing that mattered above all else. "Adam, what do you know about my brother?" she asked urgently. "Where is he? What happened to him?" Victor didn't answer immediately. His eyes flicked from Nora to Lucas, then back to her, as if deciding how much he was willing to reveal. Finally he spoke, his voice just a little softer than before. "Your brother, Adam, was a threat to some very powerful people. He uncovered something he wasn't supposed to. He went too far, too deep," Victor said, his words deliberate, as though he was choosing them carefully. "But Adam isn't dead," Nora pressed. "I know he's still alive. I can feel it." Victor raised an eyebrow, an almost imperceptible shift in his expression. Alive. Yes, for now. But it won't be for long unless you stop following this path, unless you stop digging. You've already started down a very dangerous road. Lucas let out a sharp breath. We don't need a lecture. We need answers. Victor's gaze flickered to him, then back to Nora. Answers. You want answers. He stepped closer, each movement fluid and calculated. You think Calder has all the answers. You think your father had all the answers. Nora's stomach twisted, but she stood her ground. My father wasn't involved in anything like this. He was a good man. Victor's smirk widened, but it wasn't a friendly smile. Your father was a good man, Nora. But he was also a man who made deals with people he shouldn't have. And now you're part of those deals. The words hit her like a slap. She felt the ground beneath her tremble as her entire world shifted once again. Everything she had believed about her father, everything she had trusted, was beginning to crumble. The man she had idolized, the man she had spent her whole life trying to live up to, was a player in a much darker game than she had ever imagined. You're lying, Nora whispered, her voice cracking. This can't be true. I'm not lying, Victor replied, his tone sharp. You're in the middle of something much bigger than you realize. And if you want to survive, you need to stop chasing shadows. Let it go. Lucas scoffed. And you expect us to just walk away? Victor's smile faded, his expression becoming harder, colder. No, I expect you to make the smart choice. But I'm done talking. You're on your own from here. Without another word, Victor turned and walked toward the shadows, disappearing as suddenly as he had appeared. The only sound left in the warehouse was the distant hum of machinery and the echo of their breathing. Nora felt a strange mixture of relief and unease as he disappeared. She couldn't shake the nagging feeling that everything had just taken a turn for the worse. She had come for answers, but instead, all she had was more questions. What now? Nora asked, her voice barely above a whisper as she turned to Lucas. We can't just leave it like this. We need to find Adam. Lucas stood there for a moment, his face hard and unreadable. Then he turned, his jaw clenched. We keep going. We find Silas. We find out everything. And then we decide what to do with it. But as he spoke, Nora couldn't shake the feeling that they were being led into a much darker and far more dangerous web than they could have ever imagined. Chapter 8. Unraveling the Thread. The drive back from the warehouse felt like a slow-motion descent into a pit that Nora couldn't escape. The world outside the car window seemed to blur into an endless swirl of city lights and dark shadows, the steady hum of the engine almost deafening in its monotony. Inside the car, the tension between Nora and Lucas hung thick in the air. Neither of them spoke for the entire journey, but the silence between them was loaded with unspoken questions, frustrations, and the heavy weight of the unknown. Nora's mind was racing, a storm of thoughts crashing into each other. The conversation with Victor had only deepened the mystery surrounding her father and the people involved with him. She had expected answers, a clearer path to Adam, but instead she had only received more riddles, more dead ends. Victor didn't tell us everything, she finally said, breaking the silence. Her voice was shaky, but she forced herself to meet Lucas's gaze. What if he's right? What if we're in over our heads? Lucas didn't immediately respond. His fingers gripped the steering wheel with tight control, his knuckles pale from the pressure. When he did speak, his voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that hadn't been there before. I'm not walking away, Nora. Not now. And I know you're not either, he said, his words laced with a resolve that she could feel in her bones. Victor is playing his game, but so are we. I don't trust him, and I don't believe he's telling us the whole truth. But we need to get closer to him. We need to know what he's hiding. Nora nodded slowly, though doubt gnawed at the edges of her thoughts. Lucas was right in a way. They couldn't back down. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. Not when Adam was still out there, somewhere, waiting for them to find him. Where do we start? Nora asked, her voice quieter now. more vulnerable than it had been before. Lucas glanced at her, and for a split second, she saw a flicker of something softer in his eyes, something she hadn't seen in him for a while. He didn't answer right away, but the way he exhaled, as if releasing a breath he had been holding in for a long time, told her everything she needed to know. "We find someone who knows him," Lucas said finally. "Someone who can give us more information on what's really going on." Nora felt a chill run down her spine at the thought. Victor Silas wasn't the kind of man who left loose ends. He controlled everything in his orbit. Anyone who had information about him, or about Adam, was likely just as dangerous as he was. But there was one person who had always kept to the shadows, someone who had been tied to her father's past in ways she had never fully understood. "Ben," Nora whispered, almost to herself. "Ben." Lucas echoed, a quizzical note in his voice. "Who's Ben?" Nora's fingers fumbled with the edge of her seatbelt as she turned to face Lucas. She had to explain, had to give him the pieces of her life she'd kept hidden away for so long. It was strange the way things were unfolding. In this moment, with everything on the line, it felt like she was finally stepping into the truth. "Ben was a friend of my father's," she said slowly. "He was always in the background, never part of the family business, but somehow he knew everything. My father trusted him. Ben was there for everything. Whenever my father disappeared for days, it was Ben who would show up and help pick up the pieces. He was the only one who understood the full scope of the deals my father made." Lucas's expression softened slightly, but his eyes remained intense. "And you think Ben will help us?" Nora paused, considering her words carefully. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I'm sure he's got information. He's got connections. And I think he's the only person left who knows more about my father's involvement with Victor than anyone else." Lucas didn't respond immediately, but his grip on the steering wheel tightened. They both knew the risk. If they went to Ben, there was no going back. Ben was tied to the dark corners of their pasts, and involving him could open doors that neither of them were prepared to walk through. But they had no choice. "Where do we find him?" Lucas asked, his voice steady, resigned. Nora took a deep breath, trying to calm the swirling anxiety in her chest. "There's a small apartment in the city. It's a little rundown, but it's where he used to stay whenever he needed to lay low. I don't know if he's still there, but it's our best shot." Lucas nodded, signaling for the next turn. "We'll go there then. We need answers, and I'm not leaving until we have them." As they pulled into the parking lot of an aging apartment complex later that night, the weight of what they were about to do settled heavily on Nora's shoulders. She wasn't sure what to expect when they met Ben, or whether he would even be willing to help them, but she knew one thing for certain: they had to try. The apartment was on the 3rd floor, and when they arrived at the door, Nora's stomach flipped. She hadn't seen Ben in years. She didn't even know if he'd still be willing to talk to her. She hesitated for a moment, then knocked 3 times, the sound sharp in the quiet night. The door opened slowly, and a pair of tired eyes met hers. Ben was older than she remembered, his face lined with age and the weight of years spent on the run. His clothes were worn, the faint smell of cigarette smoke and stale coffee hanging in the air behind him. He looked like he hadn't had a full night's sleep in a long time. "Nora." Ben's voice was rough, gravelly, as if he hadn't used it much in the past few years. "I didn't think I'd be seeing you again." "Ben," she said quietly, her throat tightening, "we need your help. It's about my father. And Victor Silas." The mention of Victor's name made Ben stiffen. He looked over his shoulder, as if to make sure no one was listening, before stepping aside and allowing them into the dimly lit apartment. "What's going on?" Ben asked, his voice lower now, cautious. "What are you two mixed up in?" Nora swallowed, gathering her thoughts before she spoke. "Victor Silas. He's involved in something big. My father was involved with him, and now I need to know everything you can tell me. Where is Adam? What happened to him?" Ben took a slow breath, his eyes flicking to Lucas and then back to Nora. He seemed to weigh the decision in his mind before speaking, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't want to know what's behind all of this, Nora," he said, his voice carrying a trace of fear. "Your father didn't just make deals with Silas. He made a choice, and so will you. But once you're in, there's no getting out." Chapter 9: The Choice. Ben's words hung heavy in the air, suffocating the room with their weight. Nora felt her pulse quicken, a mix of dread and desperation filling her chest. She had asked for answers, she had begged for clarity, but Ben's warning sent a cold shiver down her spine. A part of her already knew, deep down, that she wasn't going to like what he was about to say. Lucas's hand tensed on the back of the chair where he stood, his jaw tightening. He was ready, like always, for action. But Nora could see the concern in his eyes, the same worry that she felt bubbling beneath the surface of her thoughts. "I don't understand," Nora said, her voice trembling despite herself. "What do you mean? What choice did my father make? And what does this have to do with Adam?" Ben didn't immediately answer. He stood there for a moment, his eyes flickering over the room, as if searching for a way to escape the conversation. The apartment was small, almost suffocating, and the air was thick with the years of secrets Ben had been carrying. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your father was never the man you thought he was, Nora," Ben said slowly. "He wasn't just some businessman. He was tied into something far darker than you could have imagined. Victor Silas. He's not just some criminal mastermind. He's part of a much larger network, one that operates in the shadows, controlling everything behind the scenes. Your father got involved with him long before you were born, and it was never just about money." Nora's heart pounded in her chest. She took a step forward, her hands trembling as she grasped at the edges of Ben's words, desperate to understand. "Then why didn't you stop him?" Nora's voice cracked as the frustration and betrayal that had been building within her finally erupted. "Why didn't anyone stop him?" Ben's eyes softened with an expression that was almost pitying, but his voice was filled with regret as he answered. "We all made choices, Nora. Your father's was a big one. The kind of choice that ties you to something you can't escape. He couldn't get out, not after everything he did. He thought he could protect you, but by the time you were born, it was already too late." Nora's mind reeled as she tried to process his words. The shock of it all threatened to overwhelm her. The image she had held of her father, of the man who had been a pillar of stability in her life, the man she had always trusted, was crumbling. He wasn't the person she had thought he was. He had made a deal with Victor Silas, a deal that had ensnared their entire family in a web of danger. "Wait," Nora interrupted, her voice sharp with the urgency of understanding. "What does this have to do with Adam? Where is he? What happened?" Ben's expression hardened, his eyes darkening as he seemed to wrestle with whether to say more. He sighed deeply, sitting down heavily in the worn chair beside the small table. His gaze turned distant, as if lost in memories that were too painful to relive. "Your brother Adam wasn't just an innocent bystander in all of this," Ben said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of his words. "He got involved in something he shouldn't have, and he didn't understand the consequences. He dug too deep into Silas's operations. He uncovered something that your father had kept hidden for years. And when Adam found out, your father had no choice but to let him go." Nora's breath caught in her throat, the pieces of the puzzle shifting, but they didn't fit. Adam was a part of this. Had he known what their father had done? Had he known the risks? "No," Nora whispered, shaking her head. "Adam wouldn't have gotten involved in something like this. He wouldn't have. He couldn't have known what he was getting into." Ben looked at her, his eyes heavy with a truth she wasn't ready to hear. "He didn't know the full extent, no," Ben admitted. "But he was closer than your father was comfortable with. Adam was smart, too smart for his own good. And the moment he uncovered what Silas was really up to, that's when everything changed. That's when they took him." A chill swept through Nora as the weight of his words settled over her. They had taken Adam. And why? Because he had uncovered the truth about her father's deals with Victor Silas. Was that the reason he was missing? You're telling me that Adam's disappearance, it's because of what he found out about Silas? Nora asked, barely able to breathe. Ben nodded gravely. Yes, Adam's gone, and it's not just because of Silas. It's because your father made a deal to protect you from everything that Silas was involved in. Your brother was the collateral damage. But it's more than that, Nora. Your father's deal, it's what's holding you all in place, even now. Nora's hands were trembling as she grasped at her thoughts, trying to make sense of the storm that had just been unleashed on her world. Adam's disappearance was tied to her father's choices, to the things her father had done to protect her. And now, she was caught in the web. Caught in a game she didn't fully understand. I don't care about the deal, Nora said, her voice trembling with newfound determination. I just want to find Adam. I don't care what it takes. I don't care who I have to fight. I'm not letting them take him from me. Lucas stepped forward, his eyes dark with the same determination she felt pulsing through her veins. I'm with you, Nora. We'll find him. Together. Ben shook his head, his expression grim. You don't get it, do you? You think you're just going to walk into Silas's world and take your brother back? Well, you'll never get him back if you keep pushing forward like this. Silas doesn't play by the rules. Once you make a move, there's no going back. And your father knew that. That's why he kept you out of this world for as long as he could. Nora's heart pounded in her chest. Then what am I supposed to do? Just give up on Adam? Ben stood up slowly, his face grim, and his eyes locked onto hers. You need to understand, Nora. Silas is a man who controls everything. People's lives, their destinies. They're all part of the game. If you want to get Adam back, you have to be prepared to make a choice. A choice that will change everything. What kind of choice? Lucas demanded, stepping forward, his voice low. Ben's eyes flicked between them both before he sighed, the weight of his next words settling heavily in the room. You'll have to choose between saving Adam and destroying everything your father built. And there's no guarantee you'll get him back. Nora froze, the gravity of Ben's words pressing down on her with suffocating force. There was no easy way out. No simple solution. She was standing at the crossroads of a decision that could tear her apart, and she knew it. The room was silent, and all that could be heard was the thundering of her own heart as she grappled with the decision that lay ahead. Would she sacrifice everything to find her brother? Or would she walk away from the truth and let the darkness consume them all? Chapter 10: The Final Choice. The silence in the room was oppressive. Nora stood frozen, the weight of Ben's words crushing down on her. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. All she could hear was the pounding of her own heartbeat in her ears. The decision Ben had laid before her was too much to comprehend, too impossible to face. How could she choose between saving Adam and destroying everything her father had built? How could she make such a decision? She glanced at Lucas, his face just as hard, just as resolute. He had always been by her side, always ready to fight, to stand against the odds. But this was different. This was a decision that could tear everything apart. Ben, Nora said, her voice small, trembling. How do we even begin to make a choice like that? How do I choose between my brother and everything else? Ben's eyes softened, but there was no comfort in his gaze. He knew, as she did, that no amount of comforting words could make this choice any easier. This wasn't just a decision about right and wrong. This was about survival, about power, about the kind of life they were all tied to now, whether they liked it or not. You'll never really know the right choice, Ben said quietly. That's the burden of this world. You either win or you lose. But either way, there's a price to pay. Nora's stomach churned as she tried to process his words. She wanted to scream, to demand that there had to be another way, but she knew deep down that Ben was right. There was no easy way out. No fairy tale ending. Where is Adam? She asked, her voice barely a whisper, a plea hanging in the air. Tell me where he is. I need to know. I can't live with myself if I don't. Ben hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the door as if expecting someone to burst through at any moment. He let out a long breath, clearly weighing the risk of telling her. Finally he spoke. He's alive. Now. But you're too late, Ben said quietly. They've already moved him. Silas's people are holding him, and if you want him back, you have to be ready to do whatever it takes. You have to be willing to step into a world you don't understand and face the things you fear the most. There's no going back after you make this move. Nora felt a knot tighten in her throat. I don't care about the risks. I care about getting Adam back. I don't care what I have to do, Ben. The resolve in her voice surprised even her. She wasn't sure where the strength was coming from, but it was there, deep within her, pushing her forward. It was the same strength she had seen in her father, the same strength she had always admired. It was survival, and right now, survival meant finding Adam no matter the cost. Ben stood up and walked over to a small, worn desk in the corner. He rummaged through a drawer and pulled out a thin, old-fashioned envelope. He slid it across the table toward Nora. This is everything you need to know, he said quietly. This will get you to him. But you have to be careful. Silas isn't someone you can outsmart. He's always 2 steps ahead. Nora picked up the envelope with shaking hands, her eyes still locked on Ben. How do you know all this? How can you be sure? I know because I've seen it before, Ben said, his voice filled with grim resignation. I've watched people fall into his web and never come out. Your father made a choice. Now it's your turn. Lucas stepped forward, his expression hard and determined. We'll take our chances. If we don't go now, we'll never get another shot. Ben nodded, his face tight with understanding. You're right. But remember, no matter what happens, there's no going back. The world you're stepping into is far more dangerous than you can imagine. Nora didn't respond. She couldn't. Her mind was already spinning, already focused on what she had to do next. The envelope in her hand was the only thing that mattered now. It was the key, the only way to find Adam. And no matter what she had to sacrifice, she would do it. She turned to Lucas, her voice low but filled with a quiet determination. We're going. We're not turning back. Lucas gave her a single nod, the same resolve in his eyes. He didn't need to say anything. She knew what he was thinking. They had come this far together, and they would finish this together. Ben's face softened for just a moment, but the sadness in his eyes was undeniable. I wish you luck, he said, his voice heavy. You're going to need it. Nora didn't look back as they left Ben's apartment. The streets outside were cold and empty, but in that moment, they felt like they were walking toward something bigger. The final confrontation. The final choice. She could feel it pressing in on her, the weight of it all, but it wasn't fear that fueled her anymore. It was love. It was the unrelenting need to get Adam back. The drive to the location Ben had given them was quiet. Lucas didn't ask any questions. He didn't need to. They both knew what had to be done. As they pulled up to a nondescript building on the outskirts of the city, Nora's heart began to race again. This was it. The final destination. The place where everything would either fall into place or shatter beyond repair. The final test. They parked the car and approached the building cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the empty street. It was darker here, the only light coming from a flickering street lamp on the corner. They reached the door. The envelope felt heavy in Nora's hand. She hesitated for a moment, her breath catching in her throat as she glanced at Lucas. He gave her an encouraging nod. She took a deep breath, her hand trembling as she knocked 3 times. The door creaked open, and a shadowy figure appeared in the doorway. Looking for someone? The figure asked, voice low and gravelly. Yes, Nora said, her voice steady but laced with urgency. I'm looking for my brother. The figure stepped aside, allowing them to enter. As the door closed behind them, Nora felt the familiar chill of the unknown creeping back into her bones. There was no turning back now.